We're here because this is the first book published in English in the United States on Claude Parent. And he's not widely known. He's not as well known as Corbusier or other great architects, French architects. And I have to personally thank Bernard for introducing me to Claude Parent because by the end of the 90s, I didn't know who he was, but I was teaching at Columbia and I happened to attend a lecture that Bernard organized introducing Claude Parent to all the students. This was part of a transcontinental trip because he also went to California where the same thing happened at SciArc. He was introduced to a lot of people who hadn't heard of him at all. He was, in the French tradition, he did a lecture with a large scroll of paper in back of him, and he drew as he spoke. But he was, as radical as he was a very gentle creature and had a peculiar sense of humor. So he, as you'll hear later, or you perhaps already know, he and his then partner, Paul Virilio, had coined the expression, the function of the oblique, and they did a book or a manifesto called The Function of the Oblique. But he basically drew the trajectory of his career, which was at the beginning on the oblique upwards, but as soon as they devised the term function of the oblique took a downward trend, and he went into some form of eclipse for the second part of his career, partially because of his radicalism, but other reasons as well. So I want to thank Bernard for introducing me to Claude Parent, and it's sort of a historical irony that 20 years later we're here talking about the book. Can you tell us a bit how you encountered him as a Franco-Swiss architect?
Okay. Maybe I'll start with the end of the 90s. At the end of the 90s, Parent is re-emerging on the scene because he's not only someone who draws, but someone who had a partnership with an intellectual, Paul Virilio, and that mix between the theorist who would write and the inventor who would draw was quite fascinating at a time when these two, let's say, activities were considered as completely separate and under any circumstances could be combined. And the fact that Virilio, who was actually translated and reasonably well known here in America, had an existence which really in France had been made thanks to Claude Parent's drawing and of course the manifesto of the oblique. Now, before I get to the oblique, the diagonal, I think it's important to try to place the work of people like Claude Parent within their time. Much of the work emerges right after the war. In other words, in the 50s is an incredibly optimistic period, not only in Europe, but also in Japan. And the reason I'm amused to make that parallel, if you look at the book, you'll see that a number of parallels can be made with what the metabolists, the Japanese metabolists were trying to do with megastructures, with buildings which had incredible geometries and ways to challenge the idea of gravity and so on. The particularity probably of the French is that they were trying to use a formal vocabulary which was more imaginistic than what was happening in Japan, where the construction, the structural logic was still, let's say, respected with the Japanese wave, while in France, I think it went completely into a world of absolute fantasy. Now, the fantasy of Parent and the work of Virilio was fed by a few particular existing artifacts And not quite, I mean, very significantly, they were directly a result of the Second World War. Both of them were fascinated by blockhouses, you know,
Bunkers.
bunkers. The bunkers that were built by the Germans to resist a possible, invasion from the Allied forces had, of course, an architectural vocabulary that could only fascinate someone who was trying to change the way people see. And that attitude of looking around you and trying to reinvent the world out of things that nobody would have considered as architecture really happened a few years later with, say, Archigram, who were discovering oil rigs or space, research. In other words, taking artifacts that are not directly considered as architecture, but using them and starting to take them as a major part of your vocabulary. Take much later, John Haydock discovering water towers in New York and using them as a motive. So the use of, or the discovery of those bunkers becomes a form of, of a generator for a number of projects, in particular a church, which is incredibly well known, which is really conceived as a bunker, but also in a more, say, thinking mechanism, the idea of introducing the diagonal or the oblique as a way to counteract the vertical and the horizontal of most architecture throughout the years.
They discovered the oblique partially because these bunkers were not particularly well founded. They were, I don't know what the process was. A lot of Frenchmen were enslaved to build them, and so it was a really sore subject for the French. But Virilio goes into one of the bunkers that happens to be sort of surfing down an embankment because it's not well founded. They're lapsing, the sand embankments are giving way. So they go into this bunker, and they're into a completely diagonalized world because there's no up or down. And there's just small slots of small window slots through which light penetrates. So the only thing that's really vertical is their body, which is found is gravity. Apparently, Virilio discovers this. He tells Parhon that it's a topsy-turvy world. It challenges the inner ear, he calls it. Virilio says it's what is it? You get vertigo, and so this. Parhon says, vertigo, I have to see this. This is wonderful, and they go and so there's a space. It's not only the bunker as an object and as a material, it's actually spatiality that really intrigues him. And so the oblique comes out of that particular moment when they're walking into the darkened chamber and they really don't know where they are. The walls are not walls any longer. They're not ceiling. It's just a topsy-turvy world.
Yeah. Amusingly enough, it may start with a series of particular events that took place, but I think there was a spirit of the time. We were just earlier talking about the relationship with certain artists. Yves Klein, as the French call it, was a friend of Claude Parhon. They tried to do things together. Of course, Yves Klein, beside the famous invention of the color blue and all that went with it, has a series of performance art before its time, of jumping out of building and trying to literally question the idea of gravity. Now, if you're an architect, gravity is everything. Without gravity, there is no architecture. So trying to challenge gravity is really the first thing that an architect should do. And that's what they do by turning that idea of the oblique. And actually, you will see it in much of the work and the written work of Virilio, who will talk about accidents, who will talk about speed, who will talk about movement, always as a way to question the idea of certainty, the idea of solidity, the idea of stability, and in a way, the theoretical, foundations that the period was actually questioning. And I think this is important to realize that it's not only the work of those two, but it's also perhaps a whole period of questioning that happens in other disciplines, in literature, for example, or in philosophy, and the whole questioning of the foundation of society that happens with the beginning of what the Americans call post-structuralism, and now sometimes called French thought, that attitudes towards destabilizing certainties, what other people call deconstruction, was very much what was a period that was literally trying to unsettle all the certainties of perhaps the generation that preceded them. And this is what I found interesting, and that's probably the reason why I had wanted to invite the two of them to come to Columbia and give a talk. Parent was gung-ho at the idea of doing that. Virilio, on the contrary, was extremely sort of cagey. I called, actually, just to tell the story, I called at his home. I knew him a little bit because we had met several times in Paris during the 68 era. But here I call at his home. It's his wife who answered the phone, and I tell her I'd like to invite Paul to come and give a talk with Parent at Columbia University. And she responds, "Let me read you what the piece of paper which is glued over my telephone." She had a wall phone. And she starts to read. No symposium, no colloquium, no lecture, no travel. Right? And indeed he would not. And then telling the story to Peter Cook of Archigram, Peter Cook tells me, yes, it's absolutely correct. Once we organized a symposium or whatever in Bournemouth in the late 60s, he tried to get Parent and Virilio absolutely refused to come because he would not fly, he would not take a train. He would take a train, right? But generally, walking and the bicycle was at the most that he would do. So the theorist that would be the most adventurous in terms of the idea of destabilizing society and about speed and all this, himself really did not want to travel. Parent, on the other hand, was probably a lot more, adventurous and experimental. If I remember correctly, he organized part of his office and his apartment on a diagonal, on a slant, and you may know more about it and talk about it, and try to see how he could live really the way he would argue his case. So quite different, personalities, but a different, also very much part of an era which was about challenging certainties.
Well, Bernard, I think is discussing the sort of the macro view. There's also a micro view as well in terms of Parent's particular career. He started out before the First World War at the Beaux-Arts in Toulouse, where he learned how to draw, and he draws like an angel, which a lot of these illustrations here are have never been published before. It's a wonderful tome. You can sort of leave the book out on your desk and come back to another illustration the next day. He used drawings really to break out of boxes, but when he first started, he felt that the drawing, these really 19th century techniques, were really traps, graphic traps to keep your imagination from breaking out at all. The war interceded, and when he came back to the Beaux-Arts in Paris, he was still drawing, but they were still drawing on columns and Corinthian columns, and it was really the trap continued. He subversively, he's a gentleman. He was born into an affluent family in Neuilly. His father was an aeronautical engineer, where he probably got his fascination with speed and form and speed. So he subversively introduces Corbusier into the Beaux-Arts, and the Beaux-Arts professors really hated Corbusier. They thought he was merely a decorator, and then Parhon and another disaffected student introduced. They get a job at Corb's office. But he ends up rejecting too the functionalism of and the linearity of that sort of form of thinking. But his path out of it is not at all clear. So he knows how to draw like an angel. He's a cartoonist, an illustrator. He makes some money on the side that way. And this is really wonderful because there are a lot of utopian visions that are kind of where he takes the oblique into a kind of environmental scale. He's no longer just on the ground. He becomes aerial. He leaves the ground and into freedoms that are no longer sort of gravity bound. But he meets in 1951 André Bloch, he was a sculptor and editor of Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, which is kind of the primary French architecture magazine at the time. And Bloch is interested in interdisciplinarity, and he wants people to drop the idea that they're either artists or architects. He calls them all plasticiens, meaning that art and architecture have space in common, that this is how the interdisciplinarity is going to happen. And in a very incremental way, because before he meets Virilio, Parhon is already considerably down a path of radical architecture, but it's incremental. He meets a number of artists who, I have a couple names here, I can find them here. Nicolas Schoeffer, who introduces Parhon to Cubo-Futurism, and Naum Gabo, Molinage, neoplasticians. So all the incandescent art periods from the earlier part of the century come to him via artists who've been influenced by these periods themselves. So he basically breaks out of the box. And he uses actually Frank Lloyd Wright to break the Euclidean box that he feels that Corbusier has boxed himself into. So he's liberated from the box and the object. He's interested in Japanese architecture, the void, and he says I use the void to protect myself from the object. So he's no longer about the object, and it's more about the plane escaping gravity. Then he starts actually designing on the diagonal, or the oblique, he would say, before meeting Virilio. But it's as Frank Gehry would do maybe 15 years later, he really constructs an alternative education that displaces the traditional functionalism that France is now involved with by learning what artists are bringing to the table. So it's really incremental, and it's kind of artist by artist. And he eventually meets Yves Klein, who also imports a spirit. Claude Parhon talks about how he learned about wildness from Yves Klein. Klein was really wild. He died at an early age, but we have this photograph of him diving off a building in Paris. But that's basically what Parhon does on paper. He dives off the paper, into these voids that he doesn't know where he's going to really end up. He uses the 19th century graphic techniques that come out of the Beaux-Arts to really look at things differently. He doesn't know what's going to happen when he starts one of these sheets, where he's going to end up. He might think of a theme like fracture, but how are you going to break things apart? But he explores, he pushes himself through graphic drawing. He eventually, because he's left the ground, he's dealing with the oblique plane. He sort of invents these topographies. They're wall-less, which means that once somebody is living in one of the topographies, it's really a promenade. Bernard's very interested in promenades through buildings, and I think I see a certain amount of Parent in Bernard's buildings. For example, the student center at Columbia has these ramps that are going up. But so people really are not looking at the building as an object, they're looking at it as an experience, and it's the body that defines the space. It's not the container that defines the space itself. And so once he launches on the oblique, it's a natural meeting with Virilio, who comes out of phenomenology, because although we know deconstruction, constructions and all that is really language-based, phenomenology is not. It's really about the body experiencing space, the body is experiential philosophy. So the experience precedes the idea, and so it's an entirely different vector that actually flows into what's going to come in the 80s and 90s with the deconstructivists and structuralism and all that. One thing that I found particularly interesting was there's kind of a blood-body barrier between French culture and Anglo culture. And as important as he was from an international point of view and a French point of view, he didn't seem to be able to until Bernard brings him to the United States. And there's a curator, what's his name, at the Pompidou Center, Migaro, who really lifts Parent out of his obscurity in the late 80s, 90s, in this kind of revisionist point of view. But Parent told me that he went to the AA. I don't know if you know about this story, but so he's introducing the oblique to Boyarsky, who's then the director of the AA, and Boyarsky says, the oblique, we already have the diagonal, and he points to a rendering by Zaha that's behind him. So at a point when the French notion of the oblique or the diagonal could have meant the British diagonal of the oblique, Boyarsky was very protective of the AA, sort of breaks it, and so that connection was not made until you finally import him to the United States. And the AA, only after Boyarsky dies does the AA kind of get around to publishing a monograph on Boyarsky in 1996.
You know, this type of event can be very interesting because what Joseph is bringing up puts certain things together that I had never thought about. Let me continue and explain that. In 1996, Migaro, who was not yet Migaro is the chief curator for architecture at the Centre Pompidou. But at that time, he was putting together an incredible collection of architectural drawing in a provincial town outside Paris, Orléans, called the FRAC, F-R-A-C. And long before anybody else, he started to collect drawings and models from people who were really active at the beginning of the 80s. In other words, the Frank Gehry, the Wolf Pricks, the Hani Rashid, Genet, etc. And he started to get those before anybody had put them on the map.
He's the Geiger counter.
And so 5 years later, professional museum curators started to come to us and say, we'd like to buy this and that. And we'd say, it's gone, we already gave it away. Right? Now, in 1996, or rather, let's put it this way. In 1991, there is an event that takes place in Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, where 4 or 5 architects are asked each to do a pavilion. And they are Wolf Briggs, Zaha Hadid, Peter Eisenman, Rem Koolhaas, and myself. So we do pavilions in different ways, and it's interesting to look what they do. But 5 years later, Miguel at the Venice Biennale organizes the French pavilion around Claude Parent and takes all those works of another generation of architects who were all, let's say, 20 years or 30 years younger than Parent, and reconstructs a narrative of something which was another way to look at contemporary and modern architecture, which was not the Corbusier standard approach, but a non-standard approach. And at that Venice Biennale 1996, he exhibits my diagonal oblique pavilion, right? Establishing a relationship with Parent that I had not made myself. Either people like, say, Wolf Briggs of Corp Himmelblau probably already was doing it with a certain knowledge, and yet I have, and that's why I've opened this here. You know, when I look at these drawings, I immediately think of exercises that Chernikov, the constructivist, was doing. In other words, a way to challenge gravity, a way to use a very free formal invention, and literally going through the motions, curves, straight lines, angles, and so on. So that moment of challenging standard architectural convention, first with the oblique, then the next exhibition of Miguel was about non-standard architecture and using, of course, the beginning of algorithms and of digital sensibility. And actually interesting that you mentioned Zaha. Zaha did the early work is about an angular sort of set of collisions, when very soon it evolved in something which was much more subtle and much more, you know, sort of, how could I say, challenging all possible geometries. So the reason I go through this argument is that Parent is an important sort of moment in that transformation of an architecture which is there to be a machine habitée, a house, a machine to work. In other words, a functionalist functionalist and rational organization, to something which is exactly its opposite, which we will see later with now I jump a generation, 2 generations, with the work of people like Greg Lynn, Jesse Reiser, etc.
They see him as a grandfather, because although the architects of Zaha's generation respect him, and there might be some sort of influence that comes sort of obliquely into their work. It's not necessarily direct. Miguru invites Parent to one of the FRAC symposia, and they realize that the digital topographies that they're all doing on screen are preceded by his own topographies. They see a direct relationship to it all. So he's rediscovered twice But you have to understand that in the 1996 show at the Biennale, it was really an incendiary show because it was a revisionist history, and all the modernists who consider themselves the cultural heroes, like Chemetov and others, were livid. One of them took out a full-page ad in Le Monde saying this was a destructive show. That Miguru was an intellectual crook. It was really tough times for Miguru, but Miguru was really instrumental in situating this group in the Parent context, and then later by inviting the digital people, because there was a French wall in that show. I didn't see I've heard about it, but Parent was prominent in the French wall. To a certain extent, it was a response against Philip Johnson's show on deconstructivism, because Miguru wanted to take back this phenomenon to the French context, because the computer Catilla was French, the theory was French, the French artists were doing it. So it was not, he didn't want Johnson and moment to own it. So he was really establishing kind of a territory. He was just sort of urinating on the whole thing. So it was, they were staking out the French claim, and I think it was quite appropriate, actually.
Again, I love hearing Joseph. We don't meet that often, so we don't necessarily have so many opportunities to put the pieces of the puzzles together, because indeed I recognize in what you say the competition that there are between major museum institutions, and I recognize Greg Barton, who knows about that. They all try to get pieces of people's work in order to construct a narrative which is actually simultaneously a historical and an ideological narrative. And so the role of Parent is of course important in that way to say, yes, architecture is not the modern movement, Siam, Tintin, and so on. It's also something else.
I was just in Doha and to write about a building that Zaha did, a stadium. And so I was there, I was poking around, and the oblique is all over the place. Rem did a library, it's the National Library of Qatar, and the building looks a little bit like a seismic landform is emerging from the ground. But when you go in, all the books are not stacked like that, but they're stacked in planes. You have to sort of walk up hills in this direction, that direction. So he actually created a landscape that is straight out of Parent. I happened to see, and then Jean Nouvel did something called, it was the National Museum. And he took the image of a desert rose, which is a rock, a crystalline rock that shapes itself naturally in these intersecting planes. It looks like a cubo-futurist fantasy, but under the guise of a desert metaphor, he slips in this completely oblique building. It's just the ground slopes, ceiling slopes. They can't hang directly on walls because it's a wall slope, so they have to have an armature that holds the paintings off the walls. And of course, Jean Nouvel acknowledges the fact that Parent was his mentor because he worked for Parent for 3 years in the late 60s. And I had a chance to run into Rem at the Pritzker function at Versailles. So I really wanted to, you told me that of course Rem was influenced by everybody. This was my chance to ask Rem whether he was influenced by. He said of course that it's one of his influences. He absorbed lots of things, and it's a reasonable thing to say. But at the Biennale that Rem organized several years ago, which year was that?
2014.
I know that he had gone to Parent's place, and a lot of architects of our generation has gone there because we like him, we're paying our respects. But anyway, Rem went and interviewed Parent for 2 hours, took notes, and he recreated Parent's house inside the Italian pavilion, the Aperta, the white pavilion. Outside, the show was about modernism as interpreted in a lot of other countries. So he had the Domino House outside, which was built full scale, and slabs of concrete and the column, straight core. But inside, as though this were the subconscious of his own architecture, there was a recreation of Parent's pavilion, including the people who were lounging. This is probably illustrated here, the wife and friends who were lounging, sort of Roman style, on the oblique, having an oblique conversation, I assume. But if you look at Rem's buildings, there are always promenades that are either on ramps or in staircases that are treated as ramps, so that the buildings are really journeys. These ramps form a journey through the building, so you're always experiencing them physically, as Parent had really hypothesized. So although Parent had a viable career, he had a viable career, and he didn't do that many buildings. He did a variety of buildings, including shopping centers and nuclear silos, houses, apartments. The influence is now being carried to much larger buildings, including the Philharmonic by Jean Nouvel in Paris, that Nouvel dedicated to Parent. And I'm sure Parent was very satisfied to see his ideas carried to a very large scale. It's so large, it's really almost a natural landform.
I think we've covered quite a nice piece of territory and time period. Maybe the questions in the audience. Greg.
Because we're in a bookstore, wondering if you could speak more to how, aside from the exhibitions, the ideas and the work circulated at the time through magazines and books. Because I imagine, especially within Europe, that's the primary way that other people were aware of the work.
I think the 1966 was a really interesting year or 66, 68, because there were a number of manifestos, the Rossi's Manifesto, Complexity and Contradiction, but also Verlieu and Parent published something called Architecture Principe. And it wasn't a book, I think it was a cycle of magazine articles that became a book, or at any rate, it happened in 66. And so it was their manifesto. Manifestos don't have to be long or large, to be effective. And so it was kind of an important declaration of their intentions. I'm not sure about the history of Parent's work. He's very well published in France. There have been, on my bookshelf, I probably have about 14 book publications of his work, some of them small, sort of idea books. But I don't know, before 20, he went out of favor in the 70s at some point for a couple of reasons. One, France was changing a lot. There was an oil embargo, and then there was the influx of American influence. And so he accepted to do shopping centers, which a lot of the left-bank intelligentsia didn't like, because it was consumerism, and there's a whole argument against that. The Situations didn't like it, but he thought he could give it a new form. So he did these submarines emerging out of the ground on the oblique, and you walk up these paths. And then he is tapped, because of the energy crisis after the Arab embargo, to start the nuclear program in France. They decided he's fascinated by modernity. He thinks there's nothing faster than the atom. His father had been an aeronautical engineer. He's interested in speed. He drives Lamborghinis. So he thinks this is the future, and nobody knows what a nuclear silo is going to look like. And so he goes into it. It really kills his reputation so he's very successful because he's actually paid well to do this. But among people who determine what's intellectually permissible and acceptable and desirable, he's really on the wrong side of history as far as they're concerned. He told me that he didn't know at the time that the nuclear material. He thought it was just like smoke exhaust out of a car. That it did. Nobody thought it would really be a problem. He didn't realize, it was an innocence. But so he. I don't think there were many publications at that time, and certainly nothing international. But I think the publications started happening once he was rehabilitated in the 80s. And Migru was a major force in rediscovering him. And Migru can't be underemphasized in terms of, and Bernard as well, for bringing him back into respectability and honor. He said that at the low point that nobody talks about that league. His name has been completely forgotten. It was really, and he talked about his career as a sequence of highs and lows, and so he certainly had deep lows. So we've answered all your questions. Well, pick up some books on the way out.
Yes, I think I'll still pick up that last point, which is that an architect can be simultaneously someone who dreams and invents and questions, and someone who designs and builds department stores and nuclear power stations. And that strange sort of paradox is something which looks at first as an absolute contradiction, and that's one of the problem that Baron found himself with in the post-68 era, which was a very, how can I say, very moralistic era politically. So he was the parts that were more in the how could you say remember the expression imagination takes power. He would have been absolutely on that side, and at the same time the fact that he was designing temple of consumerism and militaristic sort of power station made it impossible for him to even to survive on the sort of establishment field of the time. While that tells me a lot about architecture at that time. People in, let's say, in other fields, in art or in philosophy, were able to do this sort of double move, right? Being both highly well-published, well-regarded, and at the same time, really tough thinkers that would completely revolutionize the way people think. In architecture, it's a little harder, right? And I'm pretty sure it's still a little harder today.
He was designing for the establishment. If you were building shopping centers, and he built 3 or 4, and he was also charged by the energy company of France, Électricité de France, to not only design several nuclear silos, but he actually headed up the whole program. Eventually, there were about 10 that were built. So the idea of being on the establishment side or working for the establishment was really hard to take. Virilio, for example, in 1970, when Barhan was asked to design the art pavilion at the Venice Biennale, Barhan asked Virilio to join him, but Virilio wouldn't because he'd do anything for the French government, although Barhan was happy to do it. It turned out not to be a happy experience because the artists, in fact, didn't participate with the spatiality of his building. He built everything, like that, and the artists didn't quite get it, and so they were doing self-contained work. So there was a disappointment, but the government asked him, so he did do it, and really wouldn't. So it was an anti-establishment war that was going on.
There are plenty of stories about how those two people who were very close together split and stopped talking to one another for a number of years.
You know, the funniest one I heard was I was in Paris in '68, so I knew the situation very well. But the really it was with all the students in the Odeon, the theater of the Odeon, and so the stage was closed, and the students were haranguing each other from all these balconies, and really it was inside, and Claude Parent comes by to pick Virilio up in his white Rolls Royce. This is just a thing that students are not really going to like very much, and so he didn't give a damn, and he said as to how he got his Lamborghinis and Rolls Royces. He said, I bought them with balls and credit, and he liked to épater the gauche,
Yes.
really, rather than bourgeoisie. So he was a character.
Okay, on these words, thank you for listening.